Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another fun, shiny, happy, and exciting episode of our hit podcast / video series, Back to Basics. Yay! And the silence is how excited everyone actually is. I am once again Pastor Don.
I feel like this is one of those moments where any podcast listeners are missing just my series of differently baffled facial expressions at your antics.
You know, I don't mean to speak down on the podcast. I am more of a podcast person than a YouTube person myself, but you are doing some good facial expressions. I'm not going to lie. But in any case,
continue with your traditional self-effacing.
Yes. I am that which remains of Pastor Don, and joining me is, of course, the wonderful, fantastic, amazing, and awesome Courtney Fraley. Say hi.
Hi.
Yay! So we are both here. We have taken the long journey from the last episode to this episode. It's taken us, what would you say?
Like half an hour?
5-10 minutes, 20 minutes to get here?
I don't know. Yeah. Time is meaningless.
Yeah. And in the words of Doctor Who, everyone else is taking the long way around. So you guys.
All right. Well, let's get wibbly wobbly, bibly wobbly.
Yeah, wibbly wobbly. I like it. I'm good with that. I will take it. We are continuing our fist fight with Genesis chapter 15. Last week, we looked at God's covenant with Abraham from the legal aspect, which covers the first 11 verses. Today, we're going to look at the trippier stuff, verse 12 on to the end, which is where we get Abram falling into a deep and terrifying dream sequence, followed by a series of very oddly specific predictions and promises. Courtney,
I'm reading ahead.
Yeah, you read it last week. Do you want to do it again, or do you want me to take this one? This one does have a number of names in
it. I can make rough approximations of those.
All right, then give it a shot from verse.
Why the heck not?
Mine.
If I get them wrong, please just laugh at me. I mean, well, feel free to correct me. Do it in the comments. It's good for the algorithm. Okay. Anyway,
here we go.
Okay. Starting with verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites."
All right. You actually did pretty well with all of those names. I don't think anything.
Thanks. Yeah, I used to read passages at church. It's part of why I'm not that uncomfortable doing this part. Did I read that wrong? Verse 17, because I couldn't make any sense of it.
No, when the sun had gone down, dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces.
Passed between these pieces of what?
Doesn't say.
That doesn't make. Is this a cultural context thing that we're missing? Like I think anthropological context.
I think in this case, it's referring to the various sacrificial pieces that were on the altar. That's
why not describe that? It always seems so. Sorry, but a lot of times the Bible seems very, you need to know all these specific things that only make sense in like this set of generations, and like this book is going to last forever, and most of you will have no idea why this part was important.
Well, part of that honestly relates to the one thing that people are always either surprised or angry to hear about, even the older passages of the Bible. Later editorial additions. Like, we often forget, even with stories like this far back in the Bible, we often forget that we're not dealing with a single unified story here. Like, that this wasn't just the same story that was copied from generation to generation as unchanged as humanly possible. Like, they were going back pretty constantly and making changes to this. So some stuff got left out, some stuff got added in.
Yeah, you have to think that even if it was strictly like genuinely just edited for clarity, that changes over time. That's going to morph the meaning of things over time.
Right. And you also have like actual things that are added to the text. Like, for example, consider verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. They dropped this summary of the first chunk of the book of Exodus right in the middle of Genesis 15.
Yeah.
Like, that is,
well, that's how prophecy works, right?
Well, that's how predicting the future works. Prophecy, I routinely stress, is not predicting the future. Prophecy is speaking the truth to power. We modernly misinterpret the idea of prophecy as being a prediction of the future, but that's clairvoyance, not prophecy.
Why has this never been expressed to me in a church environment?
Because
that seems very important.
Because a lot of church leaders get off on being thought of as mystics who can predict the future. I don't know what else to tell you there. But
no, I mean, like, I don't think your typical priest off the street thinks he's a prophet.
Like, no, but he does think he's in service of a tradition of clairvoyance. And this is one of the hardest things to grasp. And we're going to get into this a lot more when we get into the actual prophets. And again, when we get into Jesus himself, because he's the fulfillment of the prophets. But we think of, like, we talk about with Jesus, like the messianic prophecies, as in we imagine that as back in the Old Testament, they predicted that certain things will happen in a certain way. And then when the time came, those certain things happened in a certain way. It was a prediction of the future. But the prophets were speaking specifically to corrupt rulers and saying that when God decides in God's own time to smash the bullcrap you're doing, this is what it's going to look like, because this is how God works. They weren't saying this is exactly how it's going to happen as a prediction of the future. They were outlining how God addresses these systems of inequity, and that when it all lines up, it's going to look like this, and this is how you can tell that God is doing God's thing. So prophecy is speaking the truth to power. And in this case, we're getting a suggestion of clairvoyance, but pretty much every author I've read who's looked at verse 13 and 14 here has said almost to a T that this is something that was added to the text later to put Exodus in context. That this wasn't a case of God necessarily specifically telling Abram about Moses, but that this was the post-Moses exilic community adding their journey into Abram's journey to solidify their connection to Abram, which again,
so this isn't just like theory. This is pretty well accepted within.
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, there's always going to be dissenters to that, but that is roundly the historical appraisal.
That feels like information you should know when reading the text.
Well, yes, I think so. But it's also worth understanding that just simply dumping that information on people might lead people to think that it's dishonest. Now, this is
Isn't it more genuinely dishonest to be deceitful? It's the Bible.
Again, I'm doing a video series where I'm explicitly explaining this. I think you should talk about it. But
sorry, I'm just like retrospectively angry at the church and
no, I get that.
So
I get that. It's worth knowing that ancient culture.
Most pastors know this.
ones that have actually gone to seminary and done their homework, which is a decreasing volume these days as evangelicalism is on the rise. Like, most seminary trained pastors know that the history was assembled this way. Ancient cultures didn't view history as a one-way street in the way we do modernly. Modernly, we view history as a one-way, objective recording of facts. But ancient cultures viewed themselves in a constant dialogue with history. They were trying to find ways to place themselves in the context of a narrative that was moving forward. So for them, history was less about objective recording of facts and more about establishing and understanding our place within a train of tribal or cultural or even racial or human racial motion happening through time. So they would routinely go back and add themselves into the story at previous points, make references to what was coming in the future. All of that was very commonplace in ancient histories because they understood the role of history in a fundamentally different way.
They were keeping its context as a mythology, and not with that. I'm not saying that with reference to like veracity. But as to type of story. Sorry, I'm starting
it's a literary criticism, which is one of the 2 or 3 ways in which we look at the Bible is textual criticism, literary criticism, genre criticism. These are all ways that pastors are all trained to analyze the text. And
okay, so correct me if I'm wrong here. You're saying that the original writers here going at it non-linearly and went through and like essentially edited their own story for like retention of myth and like better storytelling?
I wouldn't say it's quite as concrete as that. What's probably more likely is that, because this was an oral history for a long time before it was written down. What's more likely to me, I think, is that Abram had his story and then he told his story going forward without this chunk. And that story was told to his descendants and their descendants going forward all the way through Egypt and the Passover and then out into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, or sometime thereabouts, the story started to include this piece so that they could place themselves in the context of Abram and Abram's covenant and things of that nature. And by the time it finally got written down, this was an incorporated piece. But that it wasn't part of Abram's telling of the story, but it did get worked into it later as the oral history got retold.
I can imagine that's just the nature of oral storytelling.
Honestly, it is. And that's like,
that makes so much more sense and it's so much less infuriating. But it's still frustrating that like this is a contextual thing that I feel like should be discussed like pretty readily in like at least an adult Bible study. And
yeah, it absolutely should. But we neglect to do that all the time because, again, and this is where it gets funny, modernly, we want to contextualize our histories in ways we understand. So when we talk about this stuff in adult Sunday school, we want to say the history is the way history has always been, because this is how we understand history. And we want to put it in ways that are understandable to ourselves. So either intentionally or instinctively, many people leading adult Bible studies or pastoring churches will just represent this as a history and not get into this kind of detail about it. And we'll leave people a little more confused for it, but it is what it is. But I think it is important for us to recognize that we're not, that trying to put the history as it was built here into our modern understanding of what history is a lot like trying to play your Sonic 2 cartridge from your Sega Genesis on your PS5. Like, you don't even have a port for that. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Although Sonic 3 and Knuckles, I wonder if that, no. So that is the thing that I really want us to keep remembering, particularly as we dig through the rest of the Bible, is that it's not just that these are old, it's that their design intent, even when they were oral histories, didn't work the same way we imagine history to work. So it's important to know that their goals weren't the same in keeping this written down. Like
we are unavoidably viewing it through our own modern lens.
Always. And we can never totally shake that. Like, even when we talk about this as oral histories, we're still using the H word here. We're still trying to think of it as a recollection of events. And to be honest, the Bible isn't an objective recollection of events. Like, it's an objective recollection of the stories that give us our identity, which is a very different thing. I
Again,
mean,
the stories which give us our identity. It's why I wish people were less like, you're saying it's not real about the mythology label. That's not what you're saying. You're describing a type of story that sticks around and sculpts culture.
and I'm also saying that the farther we get back in quote unquote history, like, the idea of or what is real becomes much more subjective anyway, because we don't know. And unless you've got a TARDIS hanging out in your back pocket, you don't know either.
Yeah.
So part of the faith journey is understanding that this is our history, but history in the sense that this is the story we're being a part of, and not in the fact that it's necessarily going to be objectively true in a modern lens. And that means being willing to do things like understand that the lesson we're meant to take from it, once we know objective truth, because sometimes we do learn objective truth. Like, there is a lot of historical evidence that suggests that the Exodus from Egypt wasn't that big of a thing. Like, it wasn't maybe more than a couple hundred people, and they snuck off and they joined with civilizations elsewhere, and by means of culture just kind of integrated and took over an area. Like, the narrative story that we have here doesn't really mesh with some of the historical accounts we're seeing. Now, there's no way of saying that we can prove those are objective histories either, because again,
No, but
damn old.
history as we understand it now is about taking the evidence that's available.
Yeah.
And well, I mean, you go far enough back, and I think you're talking more anthropology, and I'm far from. Feel like I'm showing how like low of a degree I have by even asking.
Well,
these questions.
the farther back you go, history, anthropology, and archaeology all kind of become the same thing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
But the point here is like, the Bible is historical evidence because it is an account of history in a sense. But it's not the only historical evidence out there. Like, when we talk about the Exodus, for example, there are some surviving records of the Pharaoh period in which this is supposed to happen. Not many. Like, there are evidence to Jewish slaves. Like, there's records of Jewish slaves in Egypt during that period and before. And there is a period of time after which there are no more Jewish slaves. But the numbers of them, the way in which they left, aren't recorded in the same way or suggested in the same way. And there could be any number of factors that support that or make it different. Like, I mean, I'm sure the Egyptian record keepers probably wouldn't want to make a big deal about it if their slaves' gods came down and started dropping frogs and crap. Like, you probably wouldn't. Like, that makes you look bad.
Yeah, there'd be a record of it somewhere. There'd probably be a record of it somewhere, but not necessarily in that document. And we don't have an overabundance of documentation from this period.
Exactly. Twitter wasn't a thing back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you imagine ancient Egyptian Twitter in the time of the Exodus? Bird, bird, cat, bird, cat, bird. Huh? Hieroglyphics joke, if anyone's paying attention. So that, I think, is kind of like the big piece of the first chunk of this, is setting aside the trippiness for a minute, is that this isn't like objective history here. And that's not a bad thing. Like, it's not. I know particularly the more scientific minded of us tend to get turned off when we hear that it's not an objective historical account, but it was never meant to be. Like, that wasn't what we were supposed to take away from this. So what else do we want to pick at here?
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty. That was just the first thing that jumped out at me, because like, as I was reading it, I'm like, did I misread that? But we're live, pal, like,
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, it feels powerful, the general
like, this is a big
tale being told here.
I think we can mention the end here. To your descendants I give this land, for the river of Egypt, the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kezanites, Kadamites, Hittites, Pezerites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and the Jebusites. the whole deal there. And yes, I did just wrap them out just because I wanted to show off.
Thank you, Sam. Or Fox and Socks, rather. Sorry, I've been reading too many Dr. Seuss books to my kid.
It's parenting. What you gonna do? This whole chunk here, I always like to draw attention to this because Christian historical scholars, particularly evangelical historical scholars, if you're on the podcast, I'm putting in as many air quotes as I physically can around that, often tend to interpret this as a justification for the warlike conquest of the region that happened pretty much post-Exodus. This is one of the first pieces that's used as justification for that. And there will be other points in where God says, I am giving unto you this land and the promised land and all of that. It's going to be a recurring theme. But in every instance, we get this. To your descendants, I give this land. That it's usually some phraseology that's pretty close to this. What is always important for us is to ask ourselves the question when we read this, what is God saying? And what is God not saying? God is saying here, I'm giving you this land.
He's not saying go take it by force.
Yes, he's saying this is the land of these people here. He's not saying remove these people. He's not saying kill these people. He's not saying take it solely for yourself and they don't matter. He's saying they're all already here. This is your land too. Do living in harmony things. Again, it's not represented in the text that God says kill them or don't, but this is, and I talked about this with a congregant at my previous congregation once. One of the things we have to do modernly, as Christians in particular, is to look back on the Bible using what Jesus taught us about God as a lens to understand what God was doing.
Yeah.
And now, what we understand about God in the New Testament era is that God is love. Those who dwell in love dwell there also in the Lord. So God is not going to be the sort of person who's going to stand up there and say, yeah, kill them, all of them, in as gruesome a way as you want, because they are not Jewish. They are not part of our tradition. They're not part of our family, so they don't matter. They're not real people. That's not a thing that God would say. So we look at this and we see that God doesn't actually say that in the text. Like, it's not attributed to God that you should go kill these people. And since it's not attributed in the text, and we understand God fundamentally different than that, we have to assume that the truth is that God expresses in a different way, and that the humans present were like, okay, that's ours. Let's go kill some folk.
Well, I mean, you have to look at this stuff, in that sort of a manner. Sorry, my thought spaced out on me as I was trying to spit it out. So
yeah,
as will happen with me from time to time. Another fantastic feature of this show.
That's life. But no, they do have to. We do have to look at it that way. We have to come back to the fact that this isn't. This is the story of Israel, and it's the story of Israel that becomes both modern Israel, of course, and the modern Christian community. We both evolve from this root. But we have to go back as Christians and look at it and ask, where is our God in here? How is this part of the story that we are a part of? And we see the God in here that we take to be the God of Jesus, the God of our modern religion. And that God wouldn't say go out there and kill him. So we have to roll that back. Now, I know there are some people who are legalists that might find themselves either on the Orthodox side of Judaism, or might find themselves as evangelical Christians who honestly have more in common than you would think, who would look at this and say, well, it's a legal issue. Like, God said you have permission to go in and take that land. So, like, if God said it was okay, it's okay. So let's go kill some folk. And I still hear those same arguments coming out of the evangelical church when they talk about these old stuff. Is that, hey, God said go ahead and smash them against some rocks and kill their kids and do whatever. So sweet, go rock it out. Like, it's not wrong if God says it's okay. But there's an assumption there that God said it was okay. Like, then an assumption.
Well, and God does seem to kind of go into detail when giving commands, like when he has specifics he wants followed.
And there are this is where the whole Christocentric reinterpretive lens comes into it, is one of the things we know, and we know because we just talked about it, is that later editorial addition is part of the biblical process. So when we're looking back on it with a God lens, with a Christocentric lens, part of what we're doing is saying, okay, what if this is actually God's words, and what if this is people kind of putting God's mouth and putting their words in God's mouth?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there are a couple of points where you see, like, God explicitly says, go kill these people. And like, really? Because that seems really out of context with what we had in a verse before and a verse after this. This seems like a weird thing for God to suddenly say in the middle of this otherwise innocuous passage. What gives? And then you look at it in a textual way, you're like, well, that definitely shows hallmarks of addition. And then you look at it with a Christocentric lens and say, well, it shows hallmarks of addition. And from a Christocentric perspective, God wouldn't say that. So do the math. Probably was a later addition by the people who were like, yeah, we wanted to seem like God said we did the thing or should do the thing.
Doesn't that make it difficult to parse out what is and isn't genuine?
Oh, incredibly. Why do you think all of us pastors have to go through all this training to do this stuff? Like, parsing how this is meant to be, like there's a reason why we have like the lectionary, where there's a selection of texts we go through on a 3-year cycle rather than just reading the Bible start to finish every year, is because, you know, we're long removed from the period where the ancient Catholic Church would be the only ones having a Bible in the community and you weren't allowed to read it. Otherwise, we're a long way from that, but that doesn't mean that the Bible is inherently accessible to everybody in that way. Like, you can read it, sure, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get it, because like it's an archaeological text.
Yeah, I guess that's easy to forget.
Yeah, like it is, particularly because in this modern American Christian environment, this has been a huge strain in American Christianity for the last 100 years or so, has been this belief of extreme lay accessibility to the hidden depths of the Bible. And like, as a clergy, I'll tell you, like, we want people to understand the hidden depths of the Bible, but that belief has run part and parcel with an anti-intellectualism strain in American culture to create an environment where now we feel that the Bible has to be completely comprehensible to any layperson. It must be, it has to be. And that's not true. Like, it isn't. This is an archaeological pseudo-historical text that requires a lot to parse apart. Like, we want to explain it to people, clergy, the church, everybody. We want its secrets to be known to all. But that doesn't mean that everybody can just pick up a Bible and immediately perceive all of its secrets and to completely understand it in its fullness.
That's why pastor is a job
Yeah.
that you train for and get a degree for.
And I'd be lying if I said I understood it completely. Like,
well,
my
it's meant
professors
to be a
told me the
lifelong
same
pursuit,
thing.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sure, you know, fantastic doctors straight out of med school aren't, you know, the doctors they'll eventually be as they get experience and stuff like that. Like,
yeah, like there is a depth.
That's how a career works. You're doing something that takes a great deal of applications so that other people in the community have access to the knowledge that not everybody has the time or resources, inclinations, etc., to be able to take the time to wrap their heads around.
Exactly. Like, a generalist will know many things about all of the things. A specialist will know a lot of things about one thing, but nobody will know everything about everything. That's as true in medicine as it is in theological studies. Like, I think a pretty fair generalist when it comes to this sort of stuff. Like, I know a lot about a lot of different things. I kind of studied the full breadth of things, but I'm not a specialist. I'm not a Jewish historian. I'm not an Old Testament canon expert. I'm not a Syriac scholar. Like, I know people who are, and I ask them questions from time to time if I trip up on something I don't know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I know all of those things. Doesn't necessarily mean they know all those things. Not a one of us knows all those things. It's one of the first things my best professor at seminary said when he got up to classes. All right, if you think I know everything about all this, you're definitely wrong. And this guy knew more about the Bible than any person I've met in my life. So, like, of course we don't know. That's okay. It's a journey of knowledge, and understanding how that situates with our faith is what this is about. It's not about having the most scientifically precise information, because if it was about that, honestly, we'd have skipped the whole religion thing and just started trying to build a TARDIS. Because I'm sorry to keep coming back to that, that you want to understand history that way, that's the way to do it, not by reading the Bible. But the Bible isn't about a history journey, it's about a faith journey. So that's enough ranting.
And I teased a homily out of you. Ha ha.
I know you did. It's not hard to get me to preach. It should be harder, but it's not.
No, that's why you have this calling, dude. You can and will go on expansive tangents and discussions about something you have a passion about. You have a passion about God. So
yeah. It's also an unfortunate side effect of the fact that because I'm doing this weird experimental church plant thing that Unfinished Community is, join us on Discord if you want to know more about that. I'm not preaching regular sermons, so I'm kind of a little bit pent up in that respect. So it's not hard. It's not hard to get me to lay down a sermon.
Oh.
All right. Excuse me. Anything else we want to dig into before we call it for today?
God, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like there should be, but
yeah, I don't think there's anything else. No.
yeah. I feel like the bit starting in like verse 12, just that whole 12 to 16 segment, just as a side thing, it felt well written. Yeah. Like, it was a joy to read, not like content wise, but it was like it came easily.
You know, I'll tell you a little anecdote. There is a pastor I know who's not a great pastor, someone I'm familiar with who's not, you know, a very progressive pastor, not a very, so someone I know out there who is a really terrible sermon writer, and they regularly plagiarize like nobody's business. And one of the easiest way to tell is when they have bouts of sudden coherence. Like, it's like random, then suddenly there's like two paragraphs that are like really poetic and sound great. I don't mean, if you just copied them and Google them, you can tell they definitely were not this person's original creation. This is kind of like that, to be honest. Like, the rest of this passage is written in a certain way, and then all of a sudden we have something that's deeply poetic in a wildly different way than the rest of the passage.
It paints a picture.
Yeah, it paints a
picture.
Which
I feel like the Bible doesn't always stop to do, and I get that because it's not there to be like an entertaining fictional narrative.
Yeah.
Like,
but this is also one of those. It's cool
when it does stop and paint a picture. You feel present in what's happening, at least for me.
Yeah,
the way my brain works.
It's definitely cool. It's also one of those, in terms of textual criticism, one of those call signs that we're probably dealing with a later editorial edition. So, like, this is why we get the whole Exodus thing, and that, inside that chunk right there is because, like, it's a stylistically separate chunk. That paragraph looks.
It does feel different.
Yeah, because it is. Like, it's, you know, probably by a different author from a different time period, inserted later to explain what was happening. That's okay. Like, unlike with the pastor I previously referenced, this isn't a case of plagiarism. This is a case of historical application. So it's not like something dishonest is being done here, but it is the same sort of way of identifying it. Yeah, a sudden stylistic change is almost always an indication that something fishy is going on here. But in this case, something fishy is just something from a different text, a later edition that fits with how we understand history in this period of time. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a different thing. Anything else you want to pry at?
I'm good. I think I'm good. Yeah.
Well, then we'll call it for here. Next week, we're going to dig into Genesis chapter 16. I think we'll probably pair off the whole thing. It's a pretty straightforward chapter. We are going to be dealing with the birth of Ishmael, which, spoiler alert for those of you who've been following the story of Abram and Sarai, this is not the first time that, if you'll pardon my French, Abram gets up to what we might modernly call weird sexual fuckery. He's already sold his wife into sexual slavery once. There's gonna be more stuff going on here. And so we're gonna have to talk about that. And we're going to have to talk about the cultural aspects too. Like it's going to be a thing. Will it be a two-parter? Will it not be a two-parter? Who knows? We'll find out when we sit down to record the next one. For now, the usual request, the same thing we ask you every single time and that I make Courtney do because I don't like doing it myself.
Like, share, and subscribe.
All of those things, especially the share thing. Oh my God.
And comment and join the Discord.
Yeah.
And
Well,
find us on Facebook.
Those two. Sharing this video around on Facebook, like if you can do that much at least, that is super helpful. Like the more eyes we get on this thing, the better. Yeah, she did mention the Discord. Discord is where it is at. Links to everything are down below in the description. Like if you're liking listening to the two of us rant, and I say the two of us because mostly it's me ranting, we all know this. If you like listening to these kind of rants, how much better would it be if you can rant with us? That's what the Discord server is for. Come to the place and do the thing with us, please. We want to see you. We like you. You're fun. Anyway, have a good week. We'll see you guys next week for Abram, Sarai, Hagar, Ishmael, and that fun little love quadrant geometry. Love geometry. That's happening next week. See ya. Bye.